Okay, the name of this story is A Sneezy Trap. Sonic was making his way through a green hill zone at speeds only he could achieve, collecting rings and dashing through loops as he did. Along the way, he defeated quite a few badniks, whether by running into them or jumping onto them at just the right moment. Unbeknownst to him, however, a certain arch-nemesis of him was watching him from his lab, and he had a trick up his sleeve to stop him. Look at that annoying hedgehog. How many times has he breezed through this zone by now? Eggman wondered to himself. He reached his hand to the side of him, picking up a remote control that had a large red button on it. As he did this, an evil smile began to appear on his face, along with a bit of a glimmer in the lenses of his glasses. Good thing he doesn't know about the little surprise I've set up for him. I have a feeling it'll slow him down the minute he finds it. With an evil laugh, Eggman pushed the red button on his remote. As Sonic was running, he saw something suddenly appear in the sky above him. It looked rather similar to most of the flying badniks that he destroyed before. That must have been what it was. Sonic immediately stopped, the bottoms of his shoes practically sliding against the ground as he did, and then jumped, making sure to land on the object. It didn't get destroyed, however. It remained intact, floating in the air without any visible damage. Sonic landed back on the ground, looking up at the object in curiosity. He could have sworn it would have been as easy to destroy as the other robots. Upon sensing his presence, the object turned to look at Sonic, and then spun around rapidly for a few seconds. When it was done, it had become much smaller than it already was, and Sonic became a bit confused. When he least expected it, he felt something fly into his nostrils, causing him to wince and put his hands over his nose. Ah! Sonic winced in surprise. What the? Sonic didn't know what the object was, nor did he know what happened to it, or what had gotten into his nose either. He couldn't focus on any of those questions as long as he would have liked, however. At the same time, he could feel an intense tickle find its way into his nose, starting with the edges of his nostrils. For as soon as the drone had made it into Sonic's nasal passages, it pressed a button that was located on its outside. 2 trap doors beneath it opened, and out came a large wave of yellow pollen. Once it landed on the floors of Sonic's nose, a good amount of it puffed into the air, swirling around and settling everywhere. The hedgehog looked down at his nose, which was beginning to twitch and rumble around uncontrollably. He sniffled a couple of times, but the tickle didn't die down. In fact, it seemed to make it worse. Just then, it occurred to Sonic what he was feeling in his nose, and that was when his eyes widened in shock, almost horror. No, it can't be. Is this... Sonic didn't get to finish his question, as his eyelids lowered as his mouth fell open, and his breath began to hitch. Ha! He reared his neck back a bit, then even further backward. He was going to sneeze. Ah! Joe! Sonic shot his neck forwards as he released a loud sneeze, with a good amount of spray being released from his mouth. Barely 3 seconds later, another sneeze followed, and his nose began to feel rather stuffy. Achoo! Ah! Sonic rubbed his nose with his fist. Although there was a look of clear dismay on his face, a small amount of tears were beginning to form in the bottoms of his eyes. Oh no. This feels like pollen. Huh? Ah! Sonic reared his neck back again, feeling another sneeze coming on. Before it could escape, however, he quickly brought both of his hands up to hold his nose shut to keep from sneezing again. It seemed to work for a few seconds, but almost as soon as he'd removed his hands, he exploded again. Achoo! This next sneeze was enough to blow him backward a bit, landing on the ground. He then gave 2 more sneezes, a couple of rapid-fire achoos, in less than 2 seconds. He groaned again as he rubbed his nose again, this time with his forefinger. Sonic! A couple of familiar voices called. Sonic looked up, seeing that 2 of his friends, Tails and Knuckles, were respectively flying and gliding to where he was. Both of them had heard his sneezing, so they were rushing over to see if he was all right. Once they'd gotten close enough, they landed in front of him. You all right, Sonic? Knuckles wanted to know. We were just going through the zone, and we heard you sneezing, Tails explained. Unbeknownst to the three of them, the drone that was inside Sonic's nose could hear their voices. It decided then to modify the pollen so it could react to the yellow and red colors of Sonic's friends. And with a few pushes of its buttons, that was what it did. Sonic tried to explain his problem, but before he could, his eyes widened as his nose twitched again. Achoo! Sonic brought his upper body forward again, with a small amount of spray being released from his mouth, and landing directly onto Tails. Hey! Tails flinched in slight disgust and rubbed his hands against his fur, trying to get the saliva off it. Achoo! Sonic fired another sneeze, turning his head away from Tails as he did, only for his spray to hit Knuckles instead. Dude! Knuckles cringed and rubbed his fist against his face. Say it, don't spray it. Sorry, guys, Sonic apologized, rubbing his itchy nose with his arm. I was just trying to get through a zone, and... Knowing what was going to happen, the hedgehog placed his forefinger underneath his nose to hold back the sneeze. It worked, but his eyes were filled with allergic tears, and his nose was a bit red from how badly he needed to sneeze. This pollen started making me Sonic couldn't finish his sentence. The tickle in his nose was getting stronger by the second, and he had to pull his forefinger away from his nose. At the same time, Tails and Knuckles took a few steps back, trying to avoid getting sprayed again. Achoo! Sonic let out a loud and massive sneeze, causing a large amount of spray to be released from his mouth, and a good amount of mucus to emerge from his nostrils. Achoo! 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 Gesundheit, Knuckles said as Sonic rubbed his nose again with his index finger. Thanks, Sonic replied, sniffling as he tried to keep himself from sneezing again. Are you sure it was only pollen making you sneeze like this? Tails asked. I mean, we both know you are allergic to pollen, but I've never seen you sneeze this much from it before. Neither have I, said Knuckles. Sonic nodded in agreement, but then had to sneeze again. He pressed his fist to his mouth and attempted to stifle, but it was quite painful. Yats! With another groan, Sonic rubbed his nose a few times with his arm. Tails thought for a few seconds about why this could be happening, then came up with an idea. Wait, I think I've got it. What if Eggman created a badnik that was specifically designed to enter one's nasal passages and make them sneeze, with the one thing that makes him sneeze more than anything in the world? Would he really do that? Knuckles sounded like he couldn't believe it. Well, he's always coming up with ways to incapacitate Sonic, no matter how weird his ideas might be, Tails mentioned. Achoo! Sonic sneezed again, then rubbed his nose again. Oh, jeez. Guess there's only one thing to do, Tails decided. Sonic removed his hand from his nose and lowered his eyelids, tilting his upper body back. Before he could sneeze again, however, Tails reached over to him and placed his index finger underneath his nose. The sneeze didn't follow, but the look on Sonic's face told him and Knuckles that it wouldn't be long before it escaped. Whatever you do, Sonic, don't sneeze, Tails warned. Sonic nodded a bit in understanding, though he wasn't sure how long he could manage. He held his breath and tried to get his mind off the amount of pollen in his nose, but with the pollen drone still hanging around in his nasal passages, it had managed to avoid getting blown out with each of Sonic's sneezes, no matter how forceful they might have been, and manipulating the amount of pollen it was releasing. That was much easier said than done. Oh God. Sonic inhaled, almost involuntarily. Right when it seemed like he was going to sneeze again, however, he felt another hand pressed beneath his nose. As it turned out, it was Knuckles' fist. He was trying to help him hold it back. You'd better not, Knuckles stated. I know, but I don't know how much more I can take, Sonic replied, doing everything in his power to resist letting his breath hitch. Tails and Knuckles didn't know how much longer Sonic could hold back his urge to sneeze either, but they didn't want him to sneeze any more than he already had either. It seemed like almost every moment they were with him, the tickle in his nose got stronger and stronger. Finally, however, the pollen from the minuscule drone in Sonic's nasal passages was too much for him to handle anymore, and so he exploded. Achoo! Sonic's sneeze was so powerful and came with such intense force that the amount of air he expelled from his mouth and nose blew Tails and Knuckles out of his way. By the time they'd landed, they were at least a foot away from him, and they could only watch in concern as Sonic broke into a sneezing fit. The few seconds he didn't spend releasing another massive sneeze after another were spent rubbing his nose as much as was possible for him, trying in vain to get rid of the constant tickle in his nose. "Mwahaha! I've done it! I've done it!" Eggman laughed to himself in triumph, watching as Sonic sneezed repeatedly. "I've got you now, you stupid hedgehog!" When the sneezing fit was over, Sonic sat where he was, sulking as he rubbed his red nose constantly with his forefinger. Tails walked over to him, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a tissue, which he offered to Sonic. "Gesundheit, Sonic," said Tails. Sonic managed a little smile to thank him, then took the tissue and began wiping his nose with it. "Jeez, somebody get that hedgehog an antihistamine," Knuckles said under his breath. As miserable as Sonic was, he was also dismayed that he'd fallen for his enemy's trap. He didn't know how long it was going to be before he'd expelled every bit of pollen in his nose, let alone the bad nick that was releasing said pollen and making him sneeze so badly. But one thing was for sure. There was no way Eggman was going to get away with this. The end.